So let me invite alphabetically a powerful panel that we've collected. So let me first invite David Cagigal. So David is the CIO, and as such, he serves as the division administrator of Division of Enterprise Technology, which manages the state of Wisconsin's IT assets and provides technology to state agencies as computer services, voice data, video telecommunications, and print and mail services. David holds a BS and MBA from DePaul University. Please help me give a warm welcome to David. Welcome, David. Our next panelist is Kathleen Gallagher, who is the executive director of Milwaukee Institute. Milwaukee Institute is a not-for-profit that helps forward-thinking Midwesterners learn, connect, and unlock the potential of tomorrow's technologies and high-growth businesses to help the region thrive. Please help me welcome Kathleen. Our next panelist is Dr. Martha Gray, who is a J.W. Kiekhaefer professor at MIT. Dr. Martha Gray has a multifaceted career in which she has built programs to drive biomedical technology innovation, conducted research to better understand and prevent osteoarthritis, led a preeminent academic unit, and served the profession through work with organizations and institutions. Please help me welcome Martha. We also have Dr. Joseph Smith, who's the president and CEO of Reflection Health. Dr. Smith brings decades of health IT-focused strategic, engineering, clinical, and healthcare policy expertise to the innovative digital medicine company. Please help me welcome Joseph. Thank you very much. Let me briefly talk about rules of engagement for the next 45 minutes or so. I'll request the panelists to take a couple of minutes to give us some opening comments talking about what innovation means to them and what challenges do they see and how can you, as the technology providers, as well as the consumer, can actually help address those challenges. Then we'll move to, I'll invoke some discussion by asking some questions to the panel in general, and I'll have some specific questions for individuals as well. And after that, we'll open it up to questions from you. Hopefully, all of you have downloaded this application. You'll have the ability to actually submit a question during the panel discussion, and we will leave some time for you to interact with the panelists through those questions, and your questions will appear in front of me, and I'll read as many of those questions as possible before we conclude. So with that, let me just ask the panelists if they would, maybe perhaps we can start with you, Joseph, give us some opening comments about what innovation means to you, what are some of the challenges, and what can these audience help with?
So thanks, Asif. So I come to this from the vantage point initially as a geeky engineer and then as a geeky doc. And I think about innovation as problem solving. But I think it's important to first understand if the problem one's about to solve has any potential for real impact. So importantly, innovation is not just creation. It's not simply making something new. Right, so at breakfast this morning, I took the tea bag that they offered. And it's got this really cool packaging, and when you open it up, the tea bag is in a pyramidal form. It's very cool. So that's new. I just don't think it solves a problem. I mean, the tea bag that I grew up with worked just fine, and so this is new, but it's not necessarily an innovation, and it hasn't really solved the problem. And so when I think about innovation, particularly in healthcare, I think about making sure that the effort that you're going to put in actually is going to give rise to an impact that the user can experience, that has enough value that the user will pay incrementally for it, or that it will create enough value that the system will find a way to adopt it. And so, I'm pretty relentless on this point. I think the notion of something you can do, that's not an imperative for doing it. Just the opportunity to apply a new widget to an old problem doesn't necessarily give rise to the level of being an innovation. You actually have to, at the end of the day, make a delta that moves us all forward or a sector forward. And so I'm much more about making sure that the problem that one is addressing with the technology brought to bear merits the investment.
Thank you, Joseph. Martha?
So I'm going to violently agree with Joe that if you come away with any message today, that's the most important message. I mean, I think Joe's also fond of saying something else I agree with, which is innovate or die. All of our organizations, regardless of sector, absolutely needs to drive innovation and be innovative. The problem is you can't just say, hey, I'm a leader, go forth, you innovate. That doesn't work, right? Because you don't even know if something's an innovation until you've seen what happens once it's deployed, once you're seeing that impact. What you can do is foster innovation by creating a culture that sort of systematically and rigorously forces people to answer the question, what is going to happen as a result of what I'm doing? What is that impact going to be? How is this new product going to move the needle forward? And it's surprisingly easy to say that question and incredibly challenging to set up a system in which that is relentlessly focusing on the question about how do you have impact. So I come at this from a purely academic world and at a place, MIT, that is well known for innovation. But I have to tell you, it's a real challenge there as well. Most of what happens at MIT is, we're risk averse like everybody, right? You want to do the next thing that builds on what you have, and that's not how you get innovation. We are inventing things like deep learning and the things you listed as technology, but those are actually, they're enablers, but they are not the drivers. These are the tools that make it possible to do these things we're imagining. So if we've learned anything, there's sort of maybe three main points, I would say. One is this relentless focus that you have to find mechanisms to identify what the future is going to look like and be convinced that it's going to matter. The second thing is, it is not a top-down. It cannot, I don't believe, can possibly be managed top-down. The professor can't tell the students what to do. The CEO can't really say this is what our innovation is going to be. You have to be an enabler, and that involves organizational structures and ways of working that are relatively unfamiliar to most. And the third is that this brings those two together. This is really about social engineering. It's absolutely your organizations, just as my organization, needs to think about how are people thinking and working together, and that's a social construct.
So what am I supposed to say now? I spent more than 2 decades as a business reporter at the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and watched a lot of innovation as a reporter. One of the things I covered was investments and financial markets. So, you know, derivatives, for example, which were good and bad. Black box investing. You know, I could go on about all the innovation I saw on Wall Street. Michael Lewis probably did a better job of chronicling it. You know, he wrote Liar's Poker. But I also covered technology and entrepreneurship, and I come at it from a perspective of watching companies and how they innovate. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is, you know, it used to be, particularly early in my career, the discussion was always about R&D and what companies were, what kind of research they were doing and what kind of how they were developing it. And one of the hand-wringing things around here was that there wasn't enough R&D and that R&D had been shipped out to Silicon Valley or China or other places like that. It seems like that conversation has changed in the last few years, and the discussion is now about innovation and innovation groups. So in sorting it out, one of the things I've thought about is, in many ways, innovation groups are more like business plan groups, where they're trying to take the innovations that a company has developed or the technologies a company has developed and find ways to get it into the market and find new uses for those products. So that's the way I've been thinking about it.
Thank you, Asif, for bringing the panel together and to be able to talk about this topic. Great comments from Joe and Martha and Kathleen. So what else is left for me to say? Let me dwell on where it starts in the cycle of innovation. Where does it start? It starts with perhaps everyone in this room, with an individual with an idea. You got a great idea in your heart, you know it's the best thing to do, but how do you convey that to somebody who can really make it real or have a decision-making role in that possibility? How do you do that? So that's the hard thing for the leadership, is to listen and to be able to filter out the ones that have a high probability of success and ones that are really someone's idea. So the leaders have to take away that understanding from today, is that they have a role to be able to foster and create those ideas, bring them to reality by listening very carefully. I'm guilty of this, and I'm sure some of you are as well, is that we look at people and we pigeonhole them, and they had an idea 10 years ago and they've never had another one since. But you've got to listen. You've got to listen to all those ideas and be able to understand the context of what the probability of making it a real solution for your organization. So the employees that are under your responsibilities, the employees working for an organization, all have the capacity and the capability of innovating. Perhaps they know more about that than the leader does because they do the day-to-day work. And they understand what's right and what's wrong and how things can be better. So no better place than to get that from an employee. The second part of this, where does it start, is PDS, Oracle, IBM, Amazon, the companies who spend a lot of money in R&D, and they are going to come to you and talk to you about the possibility of this great idea again. And you know as well as I do, I've got some good partners and I've got some partners that are really not so good. So again, the leadership has to decipher between all those propositions, whether it's an employee or whether it's a strategic partner. Where do you want to hook your wagon to, and which one do you think is going to have a higher degree of probability of success? So I'll just reiterate again, the leaders really need to listen where these innovations might start and where it might come from, internally or externally.
Thank you, David. Well, let's stick with you, David, for a minute. So you have, for a long time, been a champion of collaboration between public and private sector. And you have been very successful in capturing people's imagination in that area. And you're working on the broadband initiatives. And tell us, how's that going? How do you actually bring and align interests from a private sector company and bring them to serve the state of Wisconsin, for example?
Thank you for the question. It's a daily effort. Public-private partnerships, we say the 3 Ps, and that's something that's woven through our ability to succeed. We can't do it all ourselves. The state of Wisconsin does not own the network. We lease the services from service providers like AT&T, CenturyLink, and Frontier, and about 100 other small organizations throughout the state. Give you some context of who we are as a state. If some of you don't know, there's 5.7 million Wisconsinites that live in the state. There's about nearly 2,000 cities, 72 counties, our state government, and about 35,000 employees, and about 50 departments and agencies. 2,400 people in IT, 1,600 FTEs, and about 800 contractors that we try to collaborate internally, but also connect ourselves to the providers that help us do our job. BadgerNet, as Asif mentioned, This is the third iteration. There was a Badger Converged Network, BCN. We had 2 contracts in place, and that one expired, and now we're into BadgerNet. Same concept. AT&T is a managed service provider for all intents and purposes, working with all the other providers. We work through AT&T for the orders and for the administration, for the bills, and we eventually get to provide those services. We're in the middle of transitioning from a low, not so much of a low speed, but a lower speed, and going up to a gigabit of service for 760 state offices in the state, 350 libraries, and 380 of the 2,000 schools that are in the state of Wisconsin. Hopefully to be able to increase that connection to other schools eventually once they understand the value proposition that we offer. It's difficult. It is very difficult. We have a way of protecting our customers, whether it's a school or a library or state office, and private sectors are on the numbers. We need to get this done. We need to get it done quickly. We need it being in and out. Well, the state operations don't operate like that. The schools are mission critical while they're in school. We would like to have done that in the summer. The summer got away from us, so we're looking to creep in a little bit here and there with their permission. Another difficulty is the Department of Corrections. They don't let just anybody in there. There's a lot of screening that has to go on before we get there. We can't just knock on the door and say, I'm here to help you and to connect a new device. That's a lot of pre-planning for the 20 plus institutions that we have. So we carefully walk through processes that we've designed, processes that need to be continually improved. On paper, it looked like it would work. In reality, we need to tweak it a little bit. And again, with the public-private partnerships, to be able to do that, it is an enormous task of working with many, many providers. And that's just the telecom space. And we've got a lot of providers in the other parts of our department.
Thank you very much, Dave. Let's stick to this theme of how do you innovate. And so, Martha, I'm going to turn to you for, I've known you for a long time, and you've done remarkable stuff at MIT in creating frameworks and models for innovation, preparing young students coming out of the academia, getting them ready to go into the enterprise world, start their own companies. Tell us a couple of things. What are some of the models that you've seen that work? What are some of the models that don't work? And perhaps, equally importantly, how can enterprise learn from those experiences in academia?
In a word, how does it work? So I think the programs we've tried to build that have been effective, that I can say we have proof that they work, really relate to the conversations the points everybody's been making. So the classic academic focus is gaining domain knowledge. How do you actually learn something? And if you go advanced post-undergrad, it's an apprenticeship system. I work for somebody else, and by osmosis, somehow I'm going to learn to be the innovator of the future. And that has worked well, but it's been more by accident. I think the people that come out of that system, some people will, of course, be able to build businesses and create tremendous social and economic impact, and they'll do it no matter what we do in the world. But I think what we've learned is if you foster talent and say, you are going to be the innovators of the future, let's let you decide what you want to achieve and help to create the support systems that help you achieve it, not by telling you what to do. So as you said, picking problems is hard. We no longer, our attitude is we're not going to pick the problems. What you have to do is convince us, number one, if you're successful, it's going to matter. And then number two, what are the steps you're going to take to convince me you can be successful? And as a result of both of those, you really spur on really original, creative things that have a pipeline. I think an area that we've definitely not fully solved is creating a true partnership with the industrial sector. We have many people from the commercial sector that are involved in what we do and help to ask the right questions and shape it. But to your point of public-private partnerships, it's the same idea. We want to create the pipeline that you are going to deliver to your customers in the future, right? And that requires a conversation of really understanding the kinds of things that are the challenges you and your customers face. Not because we want to be in your business, but because some of them really require technological development, research, and innovation in order to enable your solutions. So there's a lot of room for expanding the conversation outside the academy to do that.
Well, thank you. Sticking to that theme, Joseph, let me turn to you. You've had a pretty illustrious career, and you have a really interesting background in the sense that you've been a healthcare practitioner, but then you also have worked in large and small corporations. So you bring this unique combination of expertise as having worked in hospitals, having been chief medical officer, and now you're running a commercial enterprise. What do you think is the need or the imperative for innovation in information management?
So I can speak to that in healthcare, which I might have said narrowly in healthcare, except I think you were good at your point, pointing out that it's a sixth of our economy, and so it's not quite so narrow. So if I'm sure all of you have experienced our healthcare system, and if everyone here loves it, then my comments can stop. But I think we understand that at least in the U.S., we commit about 17.5% of GDP and spending about $3.5 trillion to create a product that is at the bottom of the list of OECD countries in terms of outcome. And so we are number one in spending. We have certainly got that figured out. But what we haven't figured out is how to deliver an excellent product that makes it easy for practitioners and delightful for patients. When you think about ease of use and you think about healthcare, you actually have to think about those with different parts of your brain, because our healthcare system is remarkably complex, incredibly fractionated, and at the end quite inefficient and borderline ineffective. And so the push has been, from government down, and as Martha points out, innovation is rarely done well from top down. But from government down, we put in subsidies and we said, hey, we're going to create an electronic medical record backbone for this country, and we're going to make sure that information flows seamlessly. And neither of those objectives have been met. However, we have spent an awful lot of money to do so. And so as a practitioner, but also as an industry participant, the flow of information is bottlenecked everywhere, and for lots of different rational reasons by the sub-actors. And so, here in this state, we have a wonderful EMR company that, I had the pleasure of having their vice president of interoperability up on stage with me one day, and where I could actually ask him, hey, what do you do? Because, seamless interoperability, which is incredibly important to make sure that at any one point in taking care of a patient, you have access to all of the relevant information to make a decision, and that patient can have access to that information, and that their families can have at least metered access to that information. You would think, since the patient has the disease, the worry, the weight, the bill, the scar, you would think they would have access to the information, and they don't. And their practitioner who's trying to make the decisions that at times are life and death, you're hobbled in your ability to do so because the information is buttressed behind paywalls that you can't access, or built-in structures that are meant to be proprietary. And so there's an enormous opportunity, a tremendous imperative for making sure that that information is available. I think we've got lots of work to do to get that done. And so I can't help but imagine that as we spend that much of our nation's output on a poorly defined, poorly designed, and really poorly implemented distributed system, that the opportunity to unleash value is enormous. We need to innovate not just the technology, which I think it doesn't require magic to make this flow of information happen. It requires innovation more in business models than so much in technology. We can get this done if we decided to do it, but we need a little bit of a different take on the why we get this done and how important it is. I don't know, it feels like I've given a diatribe, but I think there is an enormous opportunity in healthcare to move information to patients and providers' benefit. I think we've got to engineer and architect solutions that take advantage of current technology, but also innovate on the business models that will allow us to effectively get there.
Can I jump in here?
Please.
So innovation is messy, and big companies and big academic institutions are process-oriented and efficient and not messy at all. So one of the big problems when you talk about innovation is that all of the places we want to do it aren't set up to do it. So what do? The two ways I think they tend to try and do innovation is either through a corporate venture fund or through an innovation group, and these innovation groups take on all different forms. What I've seen how do you really change into an innovative company? Well, Northwestern Mutual here in town is a great example. Big old line insurance company. How did they affect dramatic change that has turned the company upside down? They bought a startup. They bought LearnVest, and many of the LearnVest people have now been put in leadership positions, and they're changing like crazy, and it's painful and messy, and that's the conundrum of innovation, right, for a company.
Oh, absolutely. I've got a question for you, Kathleen, but I want to respond to one of the things that Joseph said. I was talking with a CTO of a large unnamed EHR company, and he said, interoperability issue? What's that? Just use our product across your system. There's no interoperability.
Yeah.
That seems to be the attitude. Kathleen, let me stay with you on how do we innovate. There's a lot of talk about how multiple disciplines have to come together, and the innovation occurs at that intersection, at that collision. Now, as your role, in your previous role, now you enterprise, but until recently, you as an author, writer, and by the way, Kathleen is a Pulitzer Prize winner writer, as I think most of you know. So you talk with a lot of leaders that want to innovate. Tell us, what did you learn? What kind of interdisciplinary collaborations that needed to occur for innovation to occur? Any lessons there?
Well, a great example of a company that has tackled this is American Family Insurance, and I've watched them go through a lot of different phases of innovation. They started out, there was a company near Madison. There was a company named Shoutlet that has a social media platform to so that all your employees can do Facebook and it can be kind of controlled. And they were considering investing in Shoutlet, and this was very early before they had their venture fund, and Shoutlet finally called and said, it's been months and we're about to go out of business, so are you in or not? And American Family thought, well, why not invest but also use the product? So they used the product, they saved the company, it went on to be successful, and that was the beginning. I've watched their experimentation. They did an accelerator with Microsoft once. They didn't do it the second time. I don't know the story, but what they've kind of come to is a corporate venture effort where it's strategic and they've defined what they're looking for. And I think what I've seen in companies a lot of times to really get robust innovation, they need some connection to the companies that are disrupting them, to the startups that are battling, trying to change their business model. And that's, there's collaboration inside the company between the marketing people, the R&D people, the innovation people, but ultimately the best thing I've seen is that clashing between the corporation and the people trying to disrupt them.
I think the audience questions have started to come in. Let me ask you just one general question, if somebody could quickly address that. So, innovation, how do we measure innovation? Innovation could be in a process, in a product, it could be in a business model, it could be in various functional areas. But how do we actually measure to make sure that actually we are achieving our objectives? What are some of the measures that you've seen in your experience? Anyone?
Well, just to follow up on what I was saying, when you have a venture capital arm, obviously you can measure your returns. I think you can also, I've seen innovation groups measure the number of products they get on the market, that they assist getting on the market.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Well, let's see if we can.
It's a hard question.
It's hard to measure. I think
anybody else wants to add to that?
No, it's a very hard question because it's not an innovation until it's deployed and brings returns, and that's a much longer term measure than I think the kind of measure you're interested in guiding decision making, right? So I think that's a critical
And that's
question.
one of the problems for these innovation groups, that they're there and who do they report to and how are they being measured, and I think they're all trying to figure that out.
But
it's
one
the
of
new frontier.
One of the things that helps though is taking a shorter term view of really setting concrete milestone objectives to say, in order to succeed, I need this many customers, or I need to have proven X, Y, or Z, and being very, very concrete, as opposed to, my AI is going to change the way people do business. You can't measure that because you haven't specified exactly the kind of target you're trying to reach.
Right. Oh, this is a topic that we're going to have to take at another time, because there's not a simple answer to that. Yeah. I want to make sure that we spend some time interacting with the audience, so the questions are coming in. So let me just pose this to the general panel here. First question is, do innovative thinking and risk-taking go hand in hand by definition?
Let me take a stab at that, Asif. I think so. I'm pretty sure that there's a risk associated with anything that's new. I used to work in the oil industry in Chicago, and they punched holes, and 1 out of 100, 1 out of 50, they struck oil. So that's a big risk, because each hole cost a lot of money. And it was a bet, and it was somebody's idea, seismic exploration. The probability of hitting oil was greater here than there, so let's do it here. And even then, it's not a guarantee. So almost everything that we talk about in terms of innovation is, if it's never been done before and you have no context and no history and no pattern, it's going to be a risk. And so what's the appetite for risk in the culture that Martha was talking about earlier, the ecosystem? Does it foster innovation? Does it foster risk-taking? That's first and foremost, and anybody who's accountable for the money. I was talking to Todd last night, and as CFO for PDS, it's all about understanding the return on investment. And if there's a set-aside in an organization that you can afford to lose that whole pile of money on innovation, you're okay with that. No one's going to be held accountable for the losses, because there will be losses with innovation. You have to build that into any value proposition with an R&D organization. You may go a year, 2 years, 3 years with zero return on investment, but you're part of an organization that's selling innovation and have a strong R&D effort, and one day you'll hit that pot at the end of the rainbow and be successful. So risk-taking goes hand in hand with innovation. I don't know how you would ever separate the two.
Well, I agree with you in theory, but in reality, I disagree with you. Because I think you have a lot of people, I think this is the conundrum of big companies. You have a lot of people who think about ways things could be done better and think about innovating, but they're not in a culture that allows them to take the risk to do it. Or you have the people who have, they have a new startup idea every day, but they never do the startup because they don't want to quit their job. So in reality, I think it's actually a problem that those two things can be detached.
So let me try to maybe bring those two thoughts together, right? Because I do think that there are a lot of people who are risk takers who are not very innovative, right? So I've raised two. I've raised two teenage boys, and so I've seen risk taken where there's no chance for innovation. And I think that there's a lot of innovative thinking that goes on, and I want to amplify a point that went by around kind of the essential requirement that there's some social interaction around innovation. Innovation doesn't occur with one person sitting in their cubicle. It results as a collision of individuals' viewpoints and expertises with others who are really quite different. And so I do think that's essential. But I don't think you get innovation success without risk-taking. I think you can have a lot of innovative thoughts, and a lot of those die on the vine because people aren't willing to invest themselves or take the risk. And then a comment about big companies. So I ran a group called Emerging Technologies for J&J, and so that's a big company, and a very good big company. But there was a management talk track which was all about, we take risks so we can innovate. But practically, the appetite for taking risk was always modest. And so in order to get real innovation in big companies, and a lot's been written on this notion of entrepreneurs where you get, you essentially wall people off from the rest of the corporate culture because it can be so thick that it precludes people who are thinking very differently. And you ironclad their funding so that it can't be removed when the projects go sideways. Because, to Kathleen's point, innovation is really messy. And big companies have antibodies toward mess. They don't love it. They stamp it out and they try to routinize it and regularize it, and they've got quality people who will make sure you do it a particular way, which is the no in innovation. Right? That's where the middle of the word comes from. It's what big structure does to innovation. And so you do need to externalize it. But I would say it's not so much the innovative thinking that's important. It's actually execution on innovation, which does require a fair bit of risk taking.
Very good point. Let's take another question from the audience. What can we do as IT professionals to prepare our environments for new technologies, for example, distributed ledger?
I'll start again. I don't know what distributed ledger is, so I'll forget about the parenthetical reference. Personally speaking, if you're running your business and it's flawless, for instance, we process 1.2 billion emails a year, or 100 million a month, or 3 million a day. 82 billion transactions on our mainframe processing. 97% of our servers are virtualized. If you do all that well, then people will trust you with an idea. If you always are running an organization that is at the best of their abilities, they might listen to you a lot better than some organization where you have outages and failures and things aren't really going too well and the whole staff is being labeled as that. You have to understand that you're probably not going to get too far down the street with a brand new idea if running the business is not going well. So my understanding around being acceptable of a new idea is something that's running really, really well, and you want to bolt on another idea or another technology to do the same thing, run it very well. There's a cycle of innovation, the idea, and then running it very well every second of the day if you're running a data center.
Great. There's a great question that just came in, and I think we should address that. How do we innovate in an organization where leaders and vendors feel threatened by innovation? I think a lot of us can resonate with that.
Part of it is just how you think about what you're doing, and maybe one way to address that is to try and reframe things. For example, someone said yesterday in a panel I managed, I love this line, the horse and buggy industry, one of their problems was that they called themselves the horse and buggy industry, and if they would have called themselves the transportation industry, things might have gone better. So semantics matter, and maybe if you can start using different words to describe things that might help.
Well, it's another great question, and Joseph, I'll probably direct that to you. What are one or two items we should be concentrating on to improve outcomes in healthcare?
Only one or two. If you look at the two dominant government organizations in healthcare, FDA and healthcare innovation, there's FDA and CMS. The FDA mission can be boiled down to two words. That's safe and effective. CMS is boiled down to two words: reasonable and necessary. And I would tell you that we are not, that innovation in healthcare will not go forward if we focus on safe, effective, reasonable, and necessary, when the things that really matter to the population are things like cost, access, better outcomes, security of healthcare information, and security of their benefits, and transparency to all of the above. And so I think we have to focus on, first, a level of transparency in healthcare that we've never had, in terms of decentralized information, getting it to everybody that's part of the process. And really focus on value, outcomes for cost. I mean, we don't pay much attention to that. Our regulatory entities are actually precluded by law from focusing on that when it is the biggest problem we have. And so I think if we unleash the opportunity for innovators to innovate on cost, and we afford a regulatory path that works beneficially to get value-based healthcare solutions to the market, we have a tremendous opportunity.
We're running against the time because we want to make sure that the audience have time to get to the next session, but I'd request that you take a few seconds each. If there's one thing that you'd like this audience to take away from this discussion, mind you, this audience consists of information technology providers and consumers. What's the one thing you'd like for them to take away from this discussion? Joseph?
Yeah. So I'm going to steal a line from Martha. It is about innovate or die. The field you're in will move exponentially quicker. And so if you're not interested in disrupting yourself, someone else will be.
So I'm going to say two things. One is that as you think about innovation, really pay attention to the younger generation, the ones that are less constrained by history and sometimes by knowledge, that amazing things can come from that. And what I want to add to the conversation on healthcare is go back to the point about what's the problem. If you ask a physician or a healthcare system what the problem is, they'll give a very different answer than the patient. So a patient comes in saying, my mom can't walk, right? The doctor says the problem is you've got a brain tumor. Those lead to very different next step consequences. So if you're going to innovate, make sure you're very broad in how you identify the problem.
Innovation is messy, and sometimes it's better to ask forgiveness rather than permission.
That's good.
Yes.
David, last word?
Listen to those ideas, discern, which is the harder part, discern which ones you think you want to back, and then fund it. You have to fund it if it's going to become a reality.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank our panel. Thank you so very much for taking the time today. And please help me give a warm round of applause to our panelists. Thank you. Mr. Miller.
Good.
All right. Well done. Thank you, all of you, for your contributions here today. I think just a quick summary with that, too. It's very clear that innovation isn't optional, right? It's a requirement of all of us, regardless of industry, regardless of role, regardless of title or what department you're in. And collaboration is key. I think that's something we heard ring true from everybody here as well. And David brought up a very interesting point too. Anytime that you're approaching innovation, you're making a little bit of a gamble. You're taking a risk. And I think recognizing that fact that delivering operational excellence today gives you that credibility to make that ask as well, which I think was a phenomenal point that he made there as well. So again, another round of applause for a great panel here today.